Hello and welcome. A very exciting day today. It's always a great time to talk about military innovation. Couldn't be a more important topic these days. We are here at the Capital Factory. There's this conference called Fed Supernova, and I'm joined by two, I would say, gifted, brilliant experts in the area of small business and innovation when it comes to military technology. They need little introduction, but let me welcome our two guests. I should say this will also appear in the Center for Military Modernization, and we are really glad to have a discussion about innovation because many will tell you it couldn't be, again, more important with what's going on in the world right now. So let's welcome David Bonifield. He is the CEO of Acme General, which is a consultancy, a boutique kind of innovation-oriented firm. And we are joined by another rock star, a scientist, Jennifer Shih. And she is the Director of Ecosystem Development for the Small Business Administration. Many of you are likely familiar with the SBA, does a lot of cutting-edge, really important work. So let's welcome two of our amazing experts.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Glad to be here.
So much to discuss. Gosh, we could talk for hours, but let me begin with sort of one of the basic premises we often hear when it comes to defense innovation. How do innovators or entrepreneurs who might come across or discover a disruptive, as it's called, technology of great value to either the operational community or the acquisition community, how do they get on DoD's radar? How do they get to this space where they can say, hey, here's a solution to one of your requirements or challenges. Let's discuss.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that the clients that we work with in the government have been wrestling with on their own side. How do they find out what's in the private sector that should be on the radar? And I think there are a couple of things that have happened over the last few years that are interesting and worth flagging. One of them relates for small businesses to the Small Business Innovation Research Program that Jennifer's been involved with and the SBA sits across. And that's an effort to release what are called open topics, where instead of requesting a specific solution, an agency will say, you tell me what I should be asking and submit a proposal. And if I like that, then I'll fund it and you can come in and do it. So that's been a pretty interesting change. And in fact, the reauthorization language for the SBIR program that's just in the process of being passed is now going to require that every agency do some variation of that. The other thing that I think is worth flagging and that the Army has been heavily involved with is experimentation programs in the field where they'll say, we're interested in networking different sensors and shooters together. And so if you think you have the right technology, you apply. If we think it's interesting, we'll invite you to come out and participate. And if we like that, then we'll figure out how to formalize a program around it.
Well, gosh, you inspired about 50 different interesting questions, but let's hear from our scientists. You're a neuroscientist as well, so we should point that out, a real expertise. What are your thoughts on this predicament?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate David bringing up the Small Business Innovation Research and its sister program, the Small Business Technology Transfer Program, SBIR and STTR, which we prefer to call America's Seed Fund, right? So it is actually beyond the Department of Defense. DoD is about half the program. So this is $4 billion of non-dilutive capital for small businesses doing research and development, so those innovators. And this is, the reason we call it America's Seed Fund is because it is typically for those innovators who are ready to transition their technology and turn it, figure out, is this worth something that could be commercialized out into the public markets or into the military or space. So America's Seed Fund is actually Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, Department of Health and Human Services, NIH, right?
Yeah.
So that covers everything. And I think it's really interesting in bringing up open topics. The Department of Defense historically has not been one that does this just, you're an innovator, give me what you have, right? It's more of a matching what topics get put out there that the agencies say that they're interested in. But the other agencies, so Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institutes of Health is one of the biggest funders there. They're almost the same size, almost $2 billion a year. And that has always been what might be referred to as open topics. They have 3 funding solicitations, they're grants, and it's really about meeting the mission of these agencies. So if you have something that might be of interest to NASA, and NASA might be an end customer, but there's also the commercial space market out there now too. That is something then to look for. Every agency publishes their topics. So if you remember nothing else from me, sbir.gov. sbir.gov, yeah. We're working more to figure out how can the Small Business Administration, we don't actually fund any of the companies. What we do is really work to serve as a friendly front door for those companies in interacting with the crazy mess of bureaucracy that is confusing but has its positives, within the federal government. And so that's what we're trying to do, is listen to the small businesses and serve their interest, serve as their voice across the entire federal government.
I think it's great that we're hearing both, and I'm really glad you mentioned that about the various government entities, because there are so many, you could almost say ubiquitous applications for cutting-edge technology. You mentioned sensor to shooter. That's certainly up our alley in terms of what we write about in terms of military applications. One of the things that you both touched on was this fascinating question of, to what extent can innovators in industry, you mentioned sending out a message as to what might be needed, right? How do they anticipate that and think, what will a given entity, whether it's Health and Human Services or the U.S. Army in combat, what are they going to need in 10 years, and what can we do now to solve that problem for them? That's something we hear about a lot from industry.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And one of the things that is there as a resource, maybe not on a 10-year time horizon, but more on a 1-year time horizon or a near-term view, is industry days that are hosted by various government agencies. And it's funny because I think the terminology is confusing to people. They hear industry day and they think this is a chance for industry to come in and present. Typically, industry days don't mean that. They mean the government is going to tell you what they're interested in, what they're looking for, what you can do to engage. And so understanding the terminology is helpful. Understanding where to find the announcements about how information is getting conveyed is also, I think, something that is a challenge, but an opportunity if the government can figure out how to get that right. The websites that are used, the ports of entry, as they call them, are not particularly user-friendly, not particularly accessible. And so from the perspective of the government, I think more effort has to be made to deliver information where the recipient that they're looking to target is going to find it, and not expect them to come to you to get it.
And that is something that, actively the Small Business Administration is working to do, right? We're trying to meet small businesses and innovators where they are, and really be what we tell companies to do. Be customer-centric. Go out there and talk to who it is you're serving to figure out what it is you need to do. And so, one of the things that David brought up, right, was, there's information out there. Can I tell you a secret? I realize I don't know how many people are listening to this, but the government publishes a lot of information because we have to. So now, with defense, there's going to be maybe less full open transparency. But if you want to see where things are going, one of the places to look at is actually from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. Every year, OSTP and the Office of Management and Budget from the White House publish a memo that is called the R&D Priorities Memo.
Wow.
And so they're telling all the agencies that this is where they want the agencies to invest in research and development. And so you can find that. It's public. We publish it. And then the other pieces are looking at agencies' appropriations, of course, appropriations. And so, digging a little bit in there into finding some of those policy documents that are out there.
Well, gosh, that's so important. It's interesting to me because the different military services, and you would know, I'm sure, like Health and Human Services or Department of Labor, they publish their strategies. So industry is there reading closely, doing a very close reading of the text and thinking, how can I meet their needs and better be in front of their requirements per se? So that was really interesting because the bottom line is a lot of companies just want to get in front of you. They want to be able to tell you, someone like you, about what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's also maybe a misconception, and part of this, I think, is related to the different types of government agencies, right, and how open they can be about talking about specific funding opportunities and topics before or if a solicitation is out there. And the reason why there's some differences there is because some of them distribute funding through contracts, and some distribute funding through grants. And so I would say, like an agency like the National Science Foundation
Yes.
or the National Institutes of Health or U.S. Department of Agriculture, those are all granting agencies. Those program directors for America's Seed Fund, they want you talking to them all the time, or like they at least, do your research first, like read up, but then send that quad chart or, your specific aims page. What is it that you're trying to do, and how can you find that match, right?
Yeah, no, it's one of the things that strikes me as interesting is that the government is so big that there's often so much information available that it's not a function of information not being there.
It's overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. Partly it's a function of discovery because it's not well organized. It's not pushed out in a way that's very accessible. But once you find it, then there's an element of sense making involved. How do I understand what this is really telling me? This program is real. This program isn't real. There's money here. There's not money there. And it's in part, I think, through lack of intent, and in part because of regulatory requirements, often quite opaque, and you need help navigating.
And that the guide, right, like the translator of translating the government jargon and certain language that gets used. It's like, well, but really, this means it's open to anyone.
Exactly.
But you have to use specific language in order to get it cleared by the general counsel's office.
That's interesting, because if you take a close look at something like FedBizOps, they'll spell out some of the requirements, but at times there can be some acquisition-oriented jargon that might not allow people to understand fully what's being looked for. But I have to ask about one of my favorite topics, and this pertains across the entire government, and it's commercial, because I know you focus on commercial technology and integrating that with government opportunities. What about something like AI? I mean, where can't you use that, right? I mean, we could talk for hours about how that's paradigm changing for the U.S. military. And when I spend a lot of time researching and writing about this stuff, one of the things I'll come across in academic articles is NIH studies of great relevance to the military. So what are some of your thoughts about how this is transferable and also continuously gaining traction?
I'm really glad, actually, that you brought up the topic of AI, because one of the kind of another maybe misconception is that, you think about the different agencies, right? Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Department of Transportation, and you think, okay, they just focus on that one thing, and that you could pick an agency that you might be interested in solving a problem for based on that name of the agency. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges just the Department of Defense, right, is like everything can help support efforts within the Department of Defense. And so AI is one of those areas where there are possible funding opportunities, whether they're more specific problem sets that are put out there by a particular agency, or it is totally open. So AI is a great example. So the NIH, right, there is so much data around health that needs to be sorted and made use of, and there's so many different possible applications. And so with the NIH, it's, are you advancing the mission of improving human health? And if you are, you should apply to NIH, right? Like you should figure out, those, again, are kind of one of those open topic type of agencies. And I think one of the other pieces around navigating the bureaucracy, the language barriers, right, in terms of having so much government speak, is also about finding your guides. And so that's actually the role that I've moved into more now in terms of bringing together the innovation and the private sector investment side a little bit closer together, because we know that America's Seed Fund is not going to bring you completely to the commercial market, possibly not to the government market yet either. And so where we need to help incentivize private capital crowd in more. But what we're looking at specifically are the ecosystem builders. So the entrepreneur support organizations like Capital Factory, the connectors who can help connect you, the innovator, to who is going to be able to help you figure out that next step and that next step.
You know, it's interesting because when it comes to AI, one of the things I've noticed is, apart from academic articles and so forth, that it's not typically written about super well in terms of the basic paradigm, new information bounced off an existing database that analytics performed, increasingly moving closer to that real-time analytics, exactly what you were talking about, sensor-to-shooter timelines. It used to be 20 minutes for the Army. Well, now with things like Project Convergence, it's 20 seconds. That mini drones can find a target and sort of execute the optimal weapon to make that attack. And then I've been surprised by NIH because they have all these interesting essays that have military relevance across the board. And that's just not something I was familiar with. So I'm sure when it comes to something like that, organizing information, as you say, there are ubiquitous applications for high-speed data processing across all entities of government.
Yeah, look, the hard truth, and I think it's not surprising to anyone who operates in the space, is that, and I think this is true across the government, it's certainly true in the defense sector, the government is good at buying things, they're not good at buying software. And the things that the government buys historically on the defense side come packaged with software. And if you went back 20 years, the hardware was the thing and there was a little bit of software that was there to help make it more effective. Now, the software is the thing and the hardware is just the shell that it comes in.
Right.
And so there's an effort to move to things like modular open source architectures and the ability to put different software into different hardware, but that's not historically how we've bought things. And the timelines that we buy things on are not suited to buying software as a service or even software as a product. And so there's a whole set of things that have to change around artificial intelligence, as important as it is for the Department of Defense to effectively operate in the space. They need to figure out how to buy services rather than buying products. They need to figure out how to buy software versus buying hardware. They need to figure out how to buy faster and allocate money more flexibly and push authorities down. And they need to figure out how to make the data that is the lifeblood of AI systems more curated, more broadly available, because it sits in these silos across the department right now. So even if you bought the right technology, getting access to the data that fuels it is a huge challenge.
Well, I love that you said that, because one of my, I wrote about the Air Force acquisition executive, William Roper, and a quote that I feel like I'm using every day is he said, software may determine who wins the next war. And that is so key and so critical, which leads me to the commercial integration technology issue. And both of you are very familiar with that. You work specifically with that integration. You hear a lot about these kind of synergies. I remember the Pentagon CIO moving or migrating to Windows 10 with a lot of the computers. How do you, I don't know if reconcile is the right word, but how do you achieve that synergy or synthesis when they might have additional security requirements or additional applications, yet there's so much value added there?
Yeah, from the perspective of small businesses, a huge issue over the last 3 or 4 years now has been exactly how do you reconcile the need to secure technology and data with the desire to pull in non-traditional actors into the government in general and the defense portion of the government specifically. It's a program called the Cyber Maturity Model Certification Program, CMMC, and it arose out of this idea that potential adversaries were exfiltrating data from the defense industrial base because it was in some cases easier to get to than information that was classified and held by the government but still quite sensitive. And so you needed to find a way to secure that. But the programs are very difficult to implement and they're very expensive to implement. And so if you're a small business and you're trying to get $1 million government contract and it's going to cost you $250,000 that you don't have to get certified to hold that information and to be awarded the contract, you're just not going to do it. And so it's a real dilemma, because you don't want to say to all of these emerging non-traditional small businesses, don't come and play. Right. But you also don't want to say we're just going to leave the door open from a security perspective and have at it to potential adversaries.
There's definitely, that is something, especially the SBA is very concerned about, right, in terms of that push and pull. Obviously, we have to protect all the data, the intellectual property from malign influence, from cybersecurity attacks. And even, like even for Main Street small businesses that are not necessarily working in the innovative technology side, they also have to be worried and concerned about getting cyber attacks, right?
Right.
And so SBA has been working to do more instruction and partnering through our resource partners, the small business development centers, in education around cybersecurity for small businesses.
Right.
Doing more also. So on America's Seed Fund for SBIR, SIBR, whatever you want to call it, or however you want to pronounce it, there is a portion of funding called the Technical and Business Assistance Fund. So this is actually money that each person every awardee, for a phase 1 award, you can get up to $5,000 of support, for phase 2 up to $50,000 for the project, and that can go towards a number of different things to support the business side and commercialization side, including cybersecurity protections. The other thing to kind of get the cost savings, agencies themselves can use that funding pool to secure services with a vendor themselves to then be able to provide that type of support for any of their awardees.
Well, I have a key question for you that's actually specific to SIBR and what you do at the SBA. I imagine in your role you would see an incoming technology or something presented, and you would help them see potential applications of something like that. And along those lines, if you go to one of the research laboratories with the military services, you cover basic research, they're finding out all the time that there are near-term applications. So I'd love an example of a SIBR success story, because there must be so many of them, because there are innovations that are fast-tracked because they're solving an immediate need. We all hear urgent need statements. So I know that was a bunch of questions at once, but I'd love your thoughts on those cutting-edge issues.
Oh my gosh, I'm trying, it's hard to pick favorites, right? So and again, it's not SBA, but the America Seed Fund funds 4,000 companies a year. And so, some of the just examples of things that are making a difference now, I would say, are, historical companies like Qualcomm was originally an SBIR awardee. Kind of more near term, we're also thinking about companies like, there's a lot of technologies that are included on Mars right now, on the rovers, Perseverance. And so again, that's NASA, but that's partly also because I don't want to play favorites with our DoD friends.
There you go. There you go. Well,
we love all our companies.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'm sure there are many successes. I hear a lot about them from the military service. You think hypersonics, lasers, a lot of those began as basic research, even GPS years ago, and they wind up with
CMOS
this
sensor actually was federal lab technology that got spun out and then funded through SBIR. And so the reason why we're able to take pictures on our cameras or our phones now with the cell phone camera is federal lab technology.
Wow.
And SBIR funding.
Well, it points to an interesting distinction in terms of what constitutes success. So from the perspective of the SBIR program or the Small Business Administration, I think if a company comes in and gets funding from the government and manages to commercialize that, grow jobs, develop the company, become a larger company, that's a success. If you're the Department of Defense and you're funding that company to solve a specific problem, and that company doesn't end up solving that problem because they find that the opportunities are greater in the private sector to pursue other, is that a success or not? I mean, it certainly is from some perspective. From your perspective, it may not be. And one of the things historically, I think that has been true about a lot of the funding that goes to small businesses through programs like SIBR and SITR is that the metric of success was essentially, did the company ultimately succeed? Were they able to commercialize and grow? Not did the money that you spent on a specific issue end up solving that specific
or
issue?
Saving lots of money because that technology got incorporated into some new system, right, into a program of record, which prevented you from having to do all sorts of other things that would have cost a ton of money.
Exactly right. And it's right. It's not even success in the sense of growing that technology. It's learning what works and what doesn't work and being smarter in defining requirements and where you invest in. But I think one of the things that the Defense Department has done in the last decade and is increasingly trying to do is to say, it's great if that company succeeds elsewhere, but let's also figure out how we can help them succeed here. And to do that, these awards that you make that often have come out of the research and development side of the Department of Defense need to be connected into the acquisition side of the house. There needs to be someone to catch the ball if it's thrown to the right spot downfield. I think the department's getting better at doing that, but it's something that's not universally true now and is difficult for a small company coming in to understand. Is this a proposal? Is this a topic where this is lined up 3 stages down to a program of record, or is this an R&D project in a lab that's not going anywhere?
Well, and the timelines too,
Yeah.
right? Maybe there was a customer, but by the time it gets to the point,
Right.
is that too late?
Well, I have such a key question for you specifically about commercial technology. And one of the things that is also true about the military is there are innovation success stories. I remember the IED threat during Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was an Army civilian when they were fast-tracking the double V hull strikers. Someone came up with this idea of if you raise off the ground and you disperse the blast debris from one side to the other, you're saving lives. Blast attenuated seats. Things of those kinds are happening all the time, in part because the Army and the military has been trying to address that challenge you mentioned, which is how do you harness and leverage and get those things. So there's that. And then secondly, one of the things I heard from Mr. Halverson was the question of security. He was the former DoD CIO. He said that even if you merge with commercial technology, you don't have to fully forsake security in the sense that, say, for example, Microsoft will download the latest security patch. So I'm sorry to botch question or jumble them, but number one, these successful innovation instances, and then number two, what about the challenge of security merging commercial and government technology? That it's kind of a double-edged sword because in many instances, it can be done.
Yeah, so you mentioned the example of the counter ID problem in Iraq, and many years ago I worked on the counter ID task force in Baghdad, and the example that always comes to mind for me from that period was there was a young enlisted soldier who noticed the problem with what were called passive infrared triggers on IED. So like when you walk in front of the door and the door opens because it senses your heat, using those triggers to sense a vehicle, and then that was causing a bomb to go off. And so an innovative young soldier said, well, if we put a heat source on a pole in front of the vehicle, then it will trigger the bomb before the vehicle gets there. So they took a spark plug and they put it in a box, put the box on a pole, and that was amazing and very effective for a period of time. But the question then becomes, how do you take that and commercialize it and turn it into a product, turn it into a business, and have it continue, and both scale and have ongoing maintenance and support and everything it needs to, turn it into a real product. And so there's a really interesting set of opportunities, I think, for small and mid-sized businesses to look to these innovations that are coming sort of from the bottom up within the Department of Defense, that are coming out of universities or at that intersection between the universities and operational units. There's a program called Pathfinder that the Army is running right now that's built partnerships between, for example, Vanderbilt and the 101st Airborne Division. But the ideas coming out of those need to be turned into businesses, need to be commercialized, need to be taken up by someone outside of the services to make them real. And it's a largely, I think, still untapped opportunity.
We're up against a couple of minutes, but I want to hear the expert assessment on a couple quick things. Now back to SBA, because I have to ask you something really critical about this. When it comes to innovation and the application of technology, one of the things that I was thinking about is finding ways to migrate that and finding ways to find fits, if you will. And one of the things, I spoke with General Todd yesterday, and he talked about persistent modernization, kind of like what you were saying, this iteration, this maturation, this evolution, so that enterprising companies can continually feed the need, so to speak. What's your sense of some of that?
So, going back to the America's Seed Fund SBIR opportunities, one of the things that's really interesting and flexibilities, right? And we talked about this a little bit with AI, where different agencies will have different use cases for some of the same core technologies. And so the Department of Homeland Security actively, it's a fairly small program overall, but they actively have a solicitation called OATS, oh my goodness, the acronyms, other agency technology solutions, where they are actively going to fund a phase 2 off of some other agency's SBIR funded phase 1. And so, you know, what they want is kind of similar to what we were talking about before with the commercial solutions, that then, hey, can we bring them into the Defense Department and make them useful for our applications? Other agencies are also interested in this.
Which is why we talked about applications across the whole of government, and that's where you do. That's where you sit, kind of looking at that. And that's really significant because there could be 50 applications for one thing that might have begun as like a more stovepipe military thing.
So then, you know, the thing about the complexity of the SBIR and STTR programs in that each of the agencies operates their own program is also a benefit. You know, I like turning bugs into features. So that, you know, no matter where you are as an innovator, there is likely to be a fit somewhere.
Roger.
And also those funding opportunities are across the entire year, so you're not stuck on a particular cycle.
I think it's been really helpful to help give innovators a roadmap of places they can go. And the last question I want a quick thought on, and this is key. We could talk forever about the threat environment. It's clearly always been important to innovate, but think right now with the pace of technological change and your point about how a COTS program, a government program, can be obsolete by the time it's ready because of all the milestones, checks, and balances, whereas industry or commercial sector is 4 steps ahead. And DOD is really on track with catching up with that and doing tons of integration. I hear about it every day. But in terms of the importance of innovation, how could it be not more critical than right now?
Look, I think there's no question that that's true. I think the question is, how do you have to adapt a very large, complex system to respond to the moment that we're in? We have a budgeting system that is the best thinking coming out of Ford in the 1960s, that Robert McNamara brought to the Defense Department to have central control, right? Congress likes it because it gives them control over how they fund things. But it takes 2 years to make a budget. You plan 5 years out. We have a requirements process that takes 18 months to get a requirement in place that you need to buy something, assuming the funding is there to do it. And none of those timelines represent anything realistic in a world that is changing at an exponential, not a linear rate. And so it all has to change. The good news is I think people are largely aware of that. There are efforts to make, there's a PPBE commission right now looking at how we do the budgeting process and how we can speed that up, but it has to change. And you have to, I think, devolve down authority, because it's this aggregation to higher levels that causes everything to slow down, because it's reviewed, revised, sent down, sent back up. You have to have the same confidence that we have in, for example, our soldiers, sailors, and airmen to make decisions at a junior level, to also make decisions about buying things at a more subordinate level.
And I think, you know, just to build on that, right, ultimately it comes down to people. So individuals, and I think there are a lot of really incredible, passionate innovators within the federal government who are trying very hard and actively from within the bureaucracy to figure out, okay, you know, here are the boundaries, how can we push them, and how can we get this innovation in?
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I've seen that. I've been to the Air Force Research Lab and the Army Research Lab, for example, and there's a lot of cutting-edge innovation going on in collaboration with CRADA's research agreements with academia and industry. Well, there you are. We could talk all day, as you know, about this pressing and very, very critical topic.